My name is Sarah Bennett, and I'll never forget the night my sister thought it would be hilarious to leave me stranded on the streets of Chicago with nothing but the clothes on my back. She stood there laughing as I begged her not to do this, her voice echoing down the hallway of our shared apartment building as she said, "Consider it a life lesson, little sis. Maybe now you'll learn to stand on your own 2 feet." That was it. No hesitation, no guilt in her eyes. Just cool laughter as she slammed the door in my face, leaving me homeless at 19 years old. But I smiled through my tears that night because I knew something she didn't. I knew that someday the tables would turn so completely that she'd be the one begging. And 15 years later, when 3 men in tactical gear showed up at her door to inform her that her harassment of me had crossed federal lines, she finally understood what real power looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how that moment changed everything, you have to understand where I came from and what it meant to be the forgotten Bennett daughter. I grew up in Riverside, Illinois, a suburb where manicured lawns and perfect family portraits hid the ugly truth about what happened behind closed doors. My family looked picture perfect from the outside. Mom worked as a real estate agent, always dressed to impress with her blonde hair perfectly styled. Dad owned a successful plumbing business that kept us comfortable but not wealthy. And then there was my sister Victoria, 4 years older than me, who seemed to absorb all the light in any room she entered. Victoria was everything our parents wanted in a daughter. Beautiful, confident, popular at school, and blessed with the kind of charisma that made adults beam with pride whenever she walked into a room. She had long auburn hair that caught the sunlight, green eyes that sparkled when she smiled, and a laugh that drew people to her like moths to a flame. By the time she was 16, she was homecoming queen, captain of the debate team, and dating the quarterback of our high school football team. Me? I was the afterthought, the quiet one who spent more time in the library than at parties. I had mousy brown hair that never seemed to cooperate, glasses that constantly slipped down my nose, and a stutter that made speaking in class feel like torture. While Victoria commanded attention effortlessly, I faded into the background, becoming invisible in my own home. The difference in how our parents treated us wasn't subtle. Victoria's achievements were celebrated with family dinners and photo sessions. When she made honor roll, Dad would take her shopping for new clothes. When she won a debate tournament, Mom would brag to everyone at the grocery store. But when I brought home straight A's or won the regional science fair, the response was always the same, lukewarm acknowledgement. "That's nice, honey," Mom would say without looking up from her phone. Dad would grunt his approval and return to his newspaper. Victoria noticed this disparity, and instead of feeling sorry for me, she seemed to revel in it. She'd make little comments at dinner designed to highlight my shortcomings. "Sarah's so lucky she doesn't have to worry about her appearance," she'd say with fake sweetness. "Not everyone can be naturally beautiful." Our parents would chuckle, thinking it was sisterly teasing, but I saw no malice in her eyes. The cruelty escalated as we got older. Victoria would borrow my things and conveniently forget to return them. She'd tell her friends embarrassing stories about me, knowing they'd spread throughout school. Once, she convinced me to let her give me a makeover for a school dance, only to deliberately make me look ridiculous so she could laugh about it with her friends later. I spent that entire evening hiding in the bathroom, scrubbing makeup off my face while trying not to cry. But the worst part wasn't Victoria's cruelty. It was how our parents enabled it. They saw her as the golden child who could do no wrong, while I was simply expected to endure whatever she dished out. "Victoria is just trying to help you," Mom would say when I complained. "She wants what's best for you." Dad's approach was even simpler. He'd tell me to toughen up and stop being so sensitive. By the time I turned 18, I'd learned to keep my head down and count the days until I could escape. I'd been accepted to Northwestern University on a full academic scholarship, something that should have made my parents proud. Instead, Victoria made sure the focus stayed on her upcoming graduation party and her acceptance to a prestigious private college that would cost our parents a fortune they were happy to spend. The night before I left for college, Victoria cornered me in my bedroom. She sat on my bed, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against my quilt, and smiled that cold smile I knew too well. You know, Sarah, I'm actually going to miss having you around to make me look good by comparison. I just stared at her, too tired to engage in another one of her games. But don't worry, I'm sure you'll find new ways to embarrass yourself in college. Just try not to mention you're my sister too often. College was supposed to be my fresh start, my chance to reinvent myself away from Victoria's shadow. And for a while it was. I thrived academically, made a few close friends, and slowly began to find my voice. I switched my major from pre-med, which my parents had pushed for, to computer science, which felt like rebellion and freedom rolled into one. I discovered I had a natural talent for coding and cybersecurity that excited me in ways I'd never experienced before. But Victoria wasn't content to let me have even the small taste of independence. She'd call me regularly, always with some crisis that required my help or attention. She'd guilt me into sending her money I couldn't afford to spare, claiming she was between jobs or had unexpected expenses. When I hesitated, she'd turn on the watermarks, reminding me that family was supposed to support each other and that I was being selfish. The pattern continued after graduation. I landed a good job at a tech startup in Chicago, finally earning enough to feel secure for the first time in my life. Victoria, meanwhile, had dropped out of her expensive college after 2 years and was bouncing between retail jobs and failed relationships. She'd moved to Chicago supposedly to be closer to me, but really because she'd burned bridges everywhere else. She convinced me to let her move in temporarily while she got back on her feet. That temporary arrangement stretched into 6 months, then a year. Victoria contributed nothing to rent or groceries, spent her days sleeping in and her nights partying with friends she'd meet at bars. She'd bring strangers home at all hours, leave messes for me to clean up, and act like I was the unreasonable one when I asked her to be more considerate. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday night in October. I'd been working overtime for weeks on a major project that could make or break my career at the startup. I was exhausted, stressed, and looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening at home with takeout and Netflix. Instead, I came home to find Victoria hosting a party in our small apartment. Music was blasting, people I didn't know were drinking my alcohol and eating my food, and my laptop, which I'd accidentally left on the coffee table, had been knocked to the floor with a cracked screen. I asked Victoria to end the party, explaining that I had an important presentation the next morning and needed to repair my laptop. She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Relax, Sarah, live a little."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Your boring work stuff can wait. When I insisted, she got angry. Really angry. She started yelling about how I was uptight and controlling, how I'd always been jealous of her ability to have fun, how I was trying to ruin her life just like I'd ruined her childhood by being such a pathetic little sister. The party guests watched this spectacle with the kind of fascination people have for car accidents. Some filmed it on their phones, which made my humiliation complete. Victoria seemed to feed off their attention, getting louder and more vicious with each insult she threw at me. She called me a loser, a failure, a pathetic virgin who'd never had a real relationship because no one could stand being around me. Finally, I'd had enough. I told everyone they needed to leave, that this was my apartment and I was paying the rent. That's when Victoria's mask slipped completely. Her green eyes turned cold as winter, and she smiled that cruel smile I remembered from childhood. "Actually, Sarah," she said slowly, "I've been meaning to tell you something. I talked to Mom and Dad, and we all agree that this living situation isn't working out." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you need to find somewhere else to live. Tonight." She pulled out her phone and showed me a text conversation with our parents, where they'd sided with her completely, calling me ungrateful and unreasonable for not accommodating my sister's social needs. I stared at the messages, feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Victoria, I'm the one on the lease. This is my apartment. Actually, she said, her smile growing wider, I had a little chat with your landlord yesterday. Turns out he's much more interested in renting to someone who pays on time and doesn't cause problems. I showed him some photos of the damage you supposedly caused, and he was very understanding about the need for you to move out immediately. My blood ran cold. What damage? What photos? She shrugged. Amazing what you can do with a little creativity and photo editing skills. Poor Mr. Peterson was so concerned about his property being destroyed by a problem tenant. She pulled out an envelope and tossed it at my feet. There's your 30-day notice. But don't worry, I convinced him to let you pack tonight instead of making you wait. Aren't I generous? I picked up the envelope with shaking hands and saw it was real. An official eviction notice dated 3 days earlier, claiming I'd violated multiple lease agreements and caused significant property damage. It was all lies, but it was legal and binding. Victoria had somehow managed to forge evidence and convince my landlord that I was the problem tenant. The party guests were recording everything now. Their phones pointed at me like I was some kind of performance art. I heard someone whisper, "This is better than reality TV," and another person laughed. Victoria basked in their attention, clearly enjoying every moment of my shock and devastation. "You can't do this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I already did." Victoria's voice was sweet as poison. "Consider it a life lesson, little sis. Maybe now you'll know to stand on your own 2 feet instead of always being such a burden on everyone around you." I looked around the apartment I'd called home for 2 years, at all my belongings scattered and mixed with the detritus of Victoria's party. My laptop was broken, my work presentation was due in 12 hours, and I had nowhere to go. The few friends I'd made in Chicago were either out of town or lived in studio apartments too small for a house guest. My parents had made their position clear in their text messages to Victoria. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. Victoria shrugged again, her expression completely indifferent to my desperation. "Not my problem anymore. Maybe try a homeless shelter? I heard they're very welcoming to people who can't take care of themselves." The cruelty of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the apartment or the lease. This was about power, about proving once and for all that Victoria was superior and I was nothing. She'd orchestrated this entire scenario to humiliate me in the most public way possible, to strip away everything I'd worked for, and leave me with nothing. I packed what I could carry in 2 suitcases, my hands shaking with rage and fear. The party continued around me as if nothing had happened, people laughing and drinking while I gathered the remnants of my life. Victoria sat on the couch like a queen holding court, accepting congratulations from her friends for finally standing up to her freeloader sister. As I wheeled my suitcases toward the door, Victoria called out one last time. "Sarah!" I turned back, hoping against hope that she had changed her mind, that some tiny spark of sisterly affection would make her take it all back. Instead, she held up her phone and took a photo of me standing there with my luggage, tears streaming down my face. "This is definitely going on social media," she said with a laugh. "The caption will be, 'When you finally stop enabling your loser sister.'" That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. Standing in that doorway, homeless and humiliated, I felt the last remnant of love I had for Victoria die. But in its place, something else grew. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more patient. A quiet determination that told me this story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I walked out into the Chicago night with nothing but 2 suitcases and a cracked laptop. But I carried something else with me too, the absolute certainty that someday, somehow, Victoria would pay for this. Not through some childish revenge scheme, but through the simple act of me becoming someone she could never touch, never hurt, never control again. I spent that first night at a 24-hour coffee shop near Northwestern, nursing a single cup of coffee and trying to salvage my work presentation from my damaged laptop. I had exactly $437 in my checking account, no credit cards, and no family who cared enough to help. But I also had something Victoria had never possessed, the ability to work harder than anyone around me, and the stubborn refusal to quit when things got difficult. By morning, I'd fixed my presentation,
found a week-to-week motel room I could barely afford, and made a promise to myself that would shape everything that came after. I was done being the forgotten Bennett daughter. I was done being anyone's victim. And most importantly, I was done letting other people's cruelty define who I was allowed to become. The girl Victoria had thrown out like garbage was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than my sister could ever imagine. But she wouldn't know that for 15 years. 15 long years during which I would build myself into someone untouchable, while she remained exactly what she'd always been, a small, cruel person who mistook temporary power for permanent victory. The motel room I could afford was the kind of place where the carpet had stains that told stories no one wanted to hear, and the ice machine had been broken since the Clinton administration. Room 247 at the Starlight Inn became my home for 3 months, long enough for me to save money for a security deposit on a tiny studio apartment across town. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every argument, every late-night phone call, every moment of other people's broken lives bleeding through the drywall. But those walls also taught me something valuable about invisibility. In a place where everyone was either running from something or trying to forget who they used to be, I learned how to become no one special, just another person trying to survive until tomorrow. It was the perfect training ground for what would come later, though I didn't know it at the time. I threw myself into work with the kind of intensity that made my coworkers worry about my mental health. While they were grabbing drinks after work or planning weekend trips, I was staying late to learn new programming languages, studying cybersecurity frameworks, and building side projects that showcase skills I didn't even know I had. My manager, a kind woman named Patricia who'd noticed my dedication, started giving me assignments usually reserved for senior developers. The work became my salvation. Every line of code I wrote was proof that I could create something from nothing. Every security vulnerability I identified was evidence that I could protect what mattered. Every project I completed ahead of schedule was a step away from that humiliating night when Victoria had stripped away everything I thought I had. Victoria, meanwhile, was living her best life in what used to be our shared apartment. She'd post photos on social media constantly, showing off her parties, her new clothes, her latest boyfriend. She'd tag me in several posts during those first few weeks, photos designed to show how much better her life was without her negative sister bringing her down. I stopped checking social media altogether after that. I had better things to do with my time. The truth was, I'd discovered something about myself during those months at the Starlight Inn. Without Victoria's constant presence to remind me that I was supposed to be the lesser sister, I'd started to see myself differently. I wasn't the awkward, stuttering girl who faded into the background anymore. I was someone who could solve problems that stumped experienced programmers. I was someone who could work 18-hour days and still have energy left over. I was someone who could survive being thrown away and come back stronger. 6 months after that terrible night, I got my first real break. Patricia recommended me for a position at Meridian Defense Systems, a government contractor that specialized in cybersecurity for sensitive federal projects. The pay was double what I'd been making at the startup, but more importantly, it was work that mattered. Instead of protecting someone's social media app or e-commerce platform, I'd be helping to secure systems that kept people safe. The interview process was grueling. Background checks that went back to elementary school, psychological evaluations that tested everything from my problem-solving skills to my ability to handle stress, and technical assessments that pushed me to the limits of my knowledge. But when I walked out of that final interview, I knew I'd found my calling. The work at Meridian was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I was part of a team responsible for identifying and patching vulnerabilities in systems used by various branches of the military and intelligence community. The projects were classified, the deadlines were absolute, and the consequences of failure were measured not in lost revenue, but in lost lives. It was exactly the kind of pressure that brought out the best in me. My colleagues were different too. These weren't Silicon Valley bros trying to disrupt breakfast cereal or whatever. These were serious people who understood that their work had real-world consequences. They judged each other based on competence and reliability, not on social skills or family connections. For the first time in my life, I was valued purely for what I could do rather than who I wasn't. I excelled in that environment. Within 2 years, I'd been promoted twice and was leading my own team of security analysts. My clearance level had been upgraded to handle increasingly sensitive projects. I was making more money than both my parents combined, living in a beautiful apartment downtown, and building a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the government's most critical systems. But the real change wasn't in my bank account or my job title. It was in how I carried myself. The stuttering, self-doubting girl Victoria had tormented was gone, replaced with someone who spoke with quiet confidence and backed up every word with demonstrated competence. I'd learned to trust my instincts, to stand up for my ideas, and to command respect through excellence rather than begging for approval. Victoria, meanwhile, had no idea about any of this, of course. As far as she knew, I was still the pathetic little sister she'd thrown out like garbage. She tried calling me a few times during that first year, usually when she needed money or someone to blame for whatever crisis she had created for herself. I stopped answering her calls after the third time she'd asked me to co-sign a loan for her. My new phone number was unlisted, and I'd moved to an apartment building with actual security so she couldn't just show up uninvited. The distance felt like freedom. For the first time in my life, I could define myself without having to react to Victoria's presence. I could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what would avoid setting her off. I could succeed without having to downplay my achievements to protect her ego. I could simply exist as myself without apologizing for taking up space. But I never forgot that night at the apartment. Even as my life improved dramatically, even as I built something worth protecting, I carried the memory of Victoria's cruelty like a small flame in my chest. Not hatred exactly, but a deep understanding of who she really was beneath the charm and the beauty. She was someone who would destroy another person's life for entertainment, someone who would betray family for the chance to feel superior, someone who mistook cruelty for strength. That understanding would prove invaluable later, when our paths crossed again and Victoria discovered that the sister she had discarded had become someone very different from the girl she remembered, someone who could protect herself and the things she'd built, someone who understood that real power wasn't about humiliating others, but about becoming untouchable yourself. The years passed quietly after that. I focused on my work, built genuine friendships with people who appreciated competence over charisma, and slowly created a life that felt solid and real. I bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood, adopted a rescue dog named Murphy who didn't care about my past, and found contentment in simple things like Saturday morning farmers markets and evening runs along the lakefront. I also started investing the money I was making at Meridian. Nothing flashy or risky, just steady, intelligent choices that would compound over time. Index funds, real estate investment trusts, a small portfolio of blue-chip stocks. I wasn't trying to get rich quick. I was building something that couldn't be taken away by someone else's whims or cruelty.
By my 30th birthday, I owned my house outright, had a healthy six-figure investment portfolio, and was being recruited by private cybersecurity firms offering salaries that would have seemed impossible when I was sleeping in that motel room. But I stayed at Meridian because the work still challenged me, and because I'd found something there that I'd never had before, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal success. I was part of something bigger now. The systems I helped protect kept soldiers safe in combat zones, prevented foreign adversaries from stealing sensitive intelligence, and maintained the digital infrastructure that supported democracy itself. It wasn't glamorous work, and I couldn't talk about most of it at dinner parties, but it was work that mattered in ways that made everything else feel worthwhile. Victoria's life, from what little I heard through mutual acquaintances, had followed a very different trajectory. She'd been evicted from the apartment she'd stolen from me when she couldn't keep up with the rent alone. She'd bounced between jobs, relationships, and apartments, always finding someone else to blame when things went wrong. She tried calling our parents for money so often that they'd eventually stopped taking her calls too. I felt no satisfaction in hearing about her struggles. That surprised me at first, given how much pain she'd caused me. But I realized that my anger toward Victoria had been replaced by something more like indifference. She was simply irrelevant to the life I'd built. Her approval couldn't help me. Her disapproval couldn't hurt me. and her presence or absence made no difference to my happiness or success. That indifference would be tested sooner than I expected. But when the test came, it wouldn't be in the form I'd imagined. It wouldn't be a confrontation or a dramatic scene. Instead, it would be a quiet demonstration of just how completely the balance of power had shifted between us, and how little Victoria understood about the woman her cruelty had created. The call came on a Thursday morning in March, 15 years after that night in Chicago. I was in my office at Meridian, reviewing security protocols for a new defense contract, when my assistant knocked on my door. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you. She says she's your sister." I looked up from my computer screen, genuinely confused for a moment. It had been so long since I'd thought of myself as anyone's sister that the words seemed to belong to someone else's life. Then the implication sank in, and I felt that old, familiar tightness in my chest. Victoria was here, in my workplace, in the life I'd built without her. "Tell her I'm in a meeting," I said automatically. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Jennifer, hesitated. "She seems pretty upset. She's been crying, and she said it was an emergency." Of course she was crying. Of course it was an emergency. Victoria's problems were always emergencies that required other people to drop everything and fix them for her. The fact that she'd tracked me down at work after 15 years of silence told me everything I needed to know about how desperate she must be. But I also recognized an opportunity when I saw one. Victoria was here because she needed something from me. She'd shown up at my office because she thought she could still manipulate me the way she had when we were children. She had no idea that the frightened girl she'd thrown out of that apartment had been replaced by someone who understood power and how to use it. "All right," I said to Jennifer. "Give me 10 minutes to finish this up, then show her to conference room B." Conference room B was our most formal meeting space, the one we used for presentations to military officials and congressional oversight committees. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Chicago skyline, a massive oak table that could seat 20 people, and oil paintings of historical military leaders on the walls. It was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were in the presence of people who held serious responsibilities and wielded real authority. It was exactly the right setting for whatever performance Victoria was about to give. I took those 10 minutes to compose myself, to remember who I was now and what I'd built. Then I walked to conference room B and opened the door to find my sister sitting at the far end of the table, looking small and out of place in the cavernous room. Victoria looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Her auburn hair, which was her pride and joy, was dull and badly cut. Her clothes were cheap and ill-fitting. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the lines around her eyes or the desperate edge to her smile. She'd brought a tissue box with her and clearly had been using it. "Sarah, oh my God, look at you. You look amazing. This place is incredible. I had no idea you were doing so well." I closed the door behind me and took a seat at the head of the table, keeping the length of polished oak between us. "Victoria, it's been a long time." She laughed nervously, dabbing at her eyes with a fresh tissue. 15 years. Can you believe it? I mean, I know we lost touch, but family is family, right? That's what Mom always said. "Mom and Dad are well?" I asked politely, though I already knew the answer. I'd hired a private investigator to check on them periodically, more out of professional paranoia than personal interest. They were both retired, living comfortably on Dad's pension and Mom's real estate investments. They'd moved to Florida 5 years ago and spent their time playing golf and pretending Victoria didn't exist. "They're fine," Victoria said quickly. "Living in Tampa now. They ask about you sometimes." That was almost certainly a lie, but I let it pass. "What can I do for you, Victoria?" She took a shaky breath, and I could see her gathering herself for whatever pitch she'd prepared. "I know this is awkward, showing up like this after so long, but I'm in trouble, Sarah." Real trouble. And you're the only person who might be able to help me. I leaned back in my chair and waited. This was her show, not mine. I made some mistakes. Some really bad mistakes.
There's this man, this guy I was seeing, and he turned out to be… God, I don't even know how to explain it. He's dangerous, like scary dangerous. And now he's threatening me because he thinks I took something from him. But I didn't. I swear I didn't take anything. The tears were flowing freely now, and I had to admit that if I didn't know Victoria as well as I did, I might have been moved by the performance. She'd always been good at this, and making herself the victim in whatever story she was telling. What kind of threats? I asked. He says he's going to hurt me. He says he knows where I live, where I work. He's been following me, Sarah. I'm scared to go home. I'm scared to go anywhere alone. She leaned forward across the table. I need help. Real help, like protection or something. You work for the government, right? Maybe you know people who can help with this kind of thing? And there it was. Victoria needed something from me. Something that my position and connections might be able to provide. She'd tracked me down after 15 years, not to apologize for what she'd done, not to rebuild our relationship, but because she'd gotten herself into trouble and thought I might be useful. The irony was almost perfect. The sister who'd thrown me out on the street was now begging for my help. The woman who'd called me to learn to stand on my own feet was asking me to save her from the consequences of her own choices. The person who'd humiliated me in front of strangers was now sitting in my conference room, crying and desperate and completely at my mercy. I could have ended it right there. I could have told her that her problems weren't my concern, that she'd made her choices and would have to live with the consequences. I could have had security escort her from the building and forgotten about her again. But I had a better idea. This man who's threatening you, I said slowly, what's his name? Victoria hesitated, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Marcus Webb. He's involved in some illegal stuff. Drugs, I think. Maybe other things. I didn't know when I started seeing him, I swear. I made a note on the pad in front of me. And what exactly does he think you took? Money. He says I stole money from his apartment, but I didn't. I would never do something like that. The words came out too quickly, too rehearsed. Victoria was lying, but that didn't surprise me. She'd been lying to get out of trouble since we were children. How much money? $50,000. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I set down my pen and looked at her carefully. $50,000 was serious money, the kind of sum that might indeed motivate someone to make threats. If Victoria had actually stolen it, she was in deeper trouble than even she realized. Where is the money now? I asked. I don't have it, she said quickly. I never had it. He's crazy if he thinks I took it. Another lie, almost certainly. Victoria had always been terrible at deception, at least with me. She'd learned to manipulate our parents through tears and tantrums, but she'd never been able to fool me. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way she was trying to figure out how much truth she could get away with revealing. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline while I considered my options. Victoria waited behind me, probably thinking I was wrestling with the decision to help her. In reality, I was deciding how to handle what came next. I can help you, I said finally, turning back to face her. The relief that washed over Victoria's face was almost pathetic. Oh God, Sarah, thank you. I knew you'd come through for me. I knew family meant something to you, even after all these years. But I'll need something in return. Her expression shifted slightly, wariness creeping in. What kind of something? I walked back to my chair and sat down, meeting her eyes across the table. The truth, all of it. What really happened with Marcus Webb, where the money is, and why you're really here.
Victoria opened her mouth to protest, probably to insist again that she was innocent, but something in my expression stopped her. Maybe she finally realized that she wasn't dealing with the frightened girl she'd known 15 years ago. Maybe she recognized that her usual tricks wouldn't work on the woman I'd become. Okay, she said slowly. Okay, but you have to promise you'll still help me after I tell you. I didn't promise anything. I just waited. Victoria took a deep breath and began to speak. The real story was both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because it confirmed everything I'd always known about her character. Worse because it revealed just how far she'd fallen since that night she'd thrown me out of our apartment. She had been involved with Marcus Webb, a mid-level drug dealer who operated out of several clubs on the South Side. Victoria had been working as a bartender at one of his establishments, skimming money from the register and selling information about customer habits to competitors. When Marcus discovered what she was doing, she'd panicked and stolen the $50,000 he kept in a safe in his apartment. "I was going to pay him back," she said, though we both knew that was another lie. "I just needed some time to figure things out." "Where's the money now?" I asked. Victoria's silence was answer enough. She'd spent it, probably on the same kinds of things she'd always wasted money on. Clothes, partying, trying to maintain the lifestyle she'd never been able to afford legitimately. "He's going to kill me, Sarah," she whispered. "I know how that sounds, but he's not the kind of person who makes empty threats. I've seen what happens to people who cross him." I believed her about that part, at least. If Marcus Webb was the kind of man who kept $50,000 in cash in his apartment, he was probably also the kind of man who took theft personally. "All right," I said. "I can help you, but it's going to be on my terms, and you're not going to like all of them." Victoria nodded eagerly. "Anything, whatever you need. First, you're going to stay in a safe location while I handle this. That means no contact with anyone from your old life, no social media, no phone calls, no leaving the apartment I arranged for you. You're going to disappear completely until this is resolved." "Okay," she said. "That makes sense." "Second, when this is over, you're going to leave Chicago. Permanently. You're going to start over somewhere else, and you're never going to contact me again unless there's a genuine emergency. Not for money, not for favors, not for anything." Victoria's face fell slightly, but she nodded. "I understand." "Third," I said, leaning forward, "you're going to apologize for what you did to me 15 years ago. A real apology, not some half-hearted excuse about how we were both young and stupid." That got a reaction. Victoria's eyes widened, and for a moment I saw a flash of the old arrogance, the instinctive rejection of any suggestion that she might have done something wrong. But it passed quickly, replaced by the desperate calculation of someone who needed my help more than she needed her pride. "Sarah," she said carefully, "I know things got heated that night, but we were both—" "No," I interrupted. "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You didn't just get heated. You didn't just lose your temper. You systematically destroyed my life for your own entertainment. You stole my apartment, ruined my credit, humiliated me in front of strangers, and threw me on the street with nothing. You did it deliberately, and you enjoyed every minute of it." Victoria stared at me, probably seeing something in my face that reminded her why she'd been afraid of me when we were children. The silence that followed my words stretched between us like a chasm. Victoria sat frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open as if she'd forgotten how to breathe. For the first time since she'd walked into my conference room, the mask of desperate vulnerability had slipped completely away. What I saw underneath was something I recognized from our childhood, the calculating look of someone trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that was spiraling away from her. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, "I was 22. We were both so young, and I was going through a really difficult time. I know I handled things badly, but I never meant to hurt you that much. You took photos of me crying and posted them on social media. You told everyone at that party that I was a pathetic virgin who would never amount to anything. You forged documents to get me evicted from my own apartment. And when I begged you not to do it, you laughed in my face and told me it was a life lesson." Each word hit her like a physical blow. I watched the color drain from her cheeks as she realized that I remembered everything, that the years hadn't softened the edges of what she'd done to me. There would be no rewriting history, no mutual agreement to pretend it had all been some kind of misunderstanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. You're right, it was cruel and unnecessary, and I've regretted it every day since it happened." That last part was almost certainly a lie, but the apology itself felt genuine. Victoria had always been selfish and manipulative, but she wasn't stupid. She could see that her old tactics wouldn't work on me anymore, that the power dynamic between us had shifted so completely that her only option was honesty. "All right," I said, standing up. "I'll help you. But remember what I said about the conditions. You follow them exactly, or you handle Marcus Webb on your own."
Victoria nodded frantically. Yes, absolutely, whatever you say. I walked to the door and opened it. Wait here. I need to make some phone calls. The next hour was spent in my office, reaching out to contacts I'd cultivated during my 15 years at Meridian Defense Systems. The government cybersecurity world was smaller than most people realized, and someone with my clearance level and track record could open doors that remained closed to ordinary citizens. I wasn't calling in favors so much as activating relationships I'd built through professional competence and mutual respect. The first call was to Agent Maria Santos at the FBI's Cybercrime Division. Maria and I had worked together on several cases involving foreign attempts to infiltrate defense contractor networks. She was tough, smart, and completely incorruptible. She was also someone who understood that sometimes the most effective law enforcement happened quietly, without press releases or public trials. "Sarah Bennett," Maria said when she answered. "Please tell me you're calling about something interesting. I'm drowning in ransomware cases that all look exactly the same." "I need information on someone," I said. "Marcus Webb, mid-level drug dealer operating out of clubs on the South Side, probably has connections to larger organizations. Is this official business? Personal, but it might become official if what I suspect is true." Maria was quiet for a moment, probably weighing the risks of helping me against the value of our professional relationship. "Give me 20 minutes, she said finally. "I'll see what I can find." The second call was to Colonel James Harrison, my liaison at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Jim was career military, a man who spent 30 years protecting sensitive information and the people who handled it. He'd also become something like a mentor to me during my early years at Meridian, recognizing talent and providing opportunities for advancement. "Sarah," he said warmly when he bricked up, "how's the new contract coming along?" "It's going well, sir, but I'm calling about a different matter. I have a family member who's gotten involved with some dangerous people. I need to understand exactly how dangerous." Jim's tone shifted immediately. "Are we talking about threats to your security clearance?" "Potentially. This person has been out of my life for 15 years, but they've recently made contact asking for help. I want to make sure that helping them won't compromise my position or create vulnerabilities in our security." "Smart thinking. What do you need?" I gave him the same basic information I'd shared with Maria, along with Victoria's full name and identifying details. Jim promised to run everything through military intelligence databases and get back to me within the hour. The third call was the most delicate. Agent David Park worked for a joint task force that focused on organized crime with national security implications. Drug dealers who laundered money for terrorist organizations, human traffickers who crossed international borders, that sort of thing. David and I had never worked together directly, but we'd been introduced at a conference on cyberterrorism and had maintained a professional relationship ever since. "David, I need to ask you something off the record," I said. "Shoot." "If someone were to, hypothetically, want a mid-level criminal to disappear from a particular city without necessarily involving the formal legal system, what would be the most effective approach?" That's a hell of a hypothetical question, Sarah. Are we talking about someone who might be useful as an intelligence asset? Possibly. Someone who might be convinced to relocate to a different jurisdiction and share information about larger criminal organizations in exchange for a fresh start? "Ah," David said, understanding immediately. "That kind of disappearing. Let me think about who might be able to help with that particular problem." By the time I finished my calls, I had a clearer picture of what Victoria had gotten herself into and what options were available for getting her out of it. Marcus Webb was indeed a dangerous man, but he was also exactly the kind of small-time operator that law enforcement agencies were always looking for leverage against. He had connections to a Colombian drug cartel that was under federal investigation, access to money laundering operations that crossed state lines, and a tendency to recruit young women as both employees and girlfriends. In other words, Marcus Webb was someone the government would very much like to have a conversation with.
And if that conversation happened to result in him leaving Chicago for an extended period, well, that would just be good police work. I returned to conference room B to find Victoria exactly where I had left her, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline with the hollow expression of someone who'd finally run out of options. She looked up when I entered, hope and fear warring in her eyes. "It's handled," I said simply. "What do you mean, handled?" I sat back down at the head of the table and folded my hands in front of me. "I mean that Marcus Webb will no longer be a problem for you. He is going to be very busy with other matters for the foreseeable future. Legal matters that will require his full attention and probably involve him relocating to a different part of the country." Victoria stared at me, clearly trying to process what I was telling her. "How is that possible? You made a few phone calls and just made him disappear?" "I didn't make him disappear," I corrected. "I simply brought him to the attention of people who were already interested in his business activities. Sometimes the most effective solutions are the simplest ones." The truth was more complicated than that, but Victoria didn't need to know the details. What she didn't need to know was that Marcus Webb was about to become the target of a coordinated law enforcement operation that would dismantle his entire organization.
Agent Santos had confirmed that his clubs were being used to launder money for a cartel that was already under federal investigation. Colonel Harrison had identified connections between Webb's operation and several individuals on terrorist watch lists. Agent Park had verified that Webb was exactly the kind of mid-level criminal that could provide valuable intelligence about larger organizations. By the time the operation was complete, Marcus Webb would be facing federal charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences measured in decades. He would be very motivated to cooperate with authorities, which would likely involve him providing information about criminal organizations in other cities, organizations that would benefit from his presence and expertise far from Chicago. In short, Marcus Webb was about to discover that threatening the sister of someone with my connections and clearance level was the kind of mistake that could end a criminal career permanently. But Victoria didn't need to understand the mechanics of how it worked. She just needed to understand that it was over. "So he's just going to leave me alone?" she asked. "He's going to forget you exist," I said, "but that doesn't change the other conditions I mentioned. You're still leaving Chicago and you're still staying out of my life permanently." Victoria nodded, though I could see her struggling with the reality of what that meant. She'd come here expecting to manipulate me into helping her and then return to her old life with a minimal amount of inconvenience. Instead, she was discovering that my help came with a price she hadn't anticipated. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked. "That's up to you. I'll give you enough money to get established somewhere new, but after that you're on your own. No more family connections to fall back on, no more people to bail you out when you make poor choices. You'll have to learn to stand on your own 2 feet. The irony of using her own words against her wasn't lost on either of us. Victoria flinched as if I'd slapped her, but she didn't argue. She couldn't argue. We both knew that she needed this help more than I needed to give it. "I have one more question," I said. "What made you think you could come here and ask for my help after what you did to me?" Victoria was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands folded in her lap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was desperate," she said, "and I guess I hoped that you were still the same person, the person who would help family no matter what, who would put aside personal feelings if someone really needed you." "You thought I was still weak," I translated. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "I thought you were still kind." That hit harder than I'd expected, because she wasn't entirely wrong. The girl she'd thrown out on the street 15 years ago would have helped her without conditions, would have put family loyalty above personal dignity, would have found a way to forgive the unforgivable. That girl had been kind in ways that made her vulnerable to people like Victoria. But kindness without boundaries wasn't actually kindness at all. It was self-destruction disguised as virtue. The woman I'd become understood that some people had to earn consideration, that some actions couldn't be forgiven without consequences, that helping someone who refused to change was ultimately helping no one. "I am kind," I said finally. "I'm helping you, aren't I? But I'm not naive anymore. I won't let kindness be used as a weapon against me." Victoria nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I understand, and Sarah, thank you. I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." I stood up again and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I'd built my life and my career. Somewhere out there, federal agents were preparing to end Marcus Webb's criminal enterprise. Somewhere else, Victoria would soon be starting over in a place where her past couldn't follow her. And here in this conference room, the last loose thread from my old life was finally being tied off. "Jennifer will arrange a hotel room for you tonight. Tomorrow someone will pick you up and drive you to the airport. Where you go from there is your choice, but I suggest picking somewhere warm. Fresh starts are easier when the weather is nice." "Sarah," Victoria said softly, "will I ever see you again?" I turned back to face her, studying the woman who had once been the most important person in my world, and then become the source of its destruction. She looked older than her 34 years, worn down by the consequences of choices that seemed clever at the time. But she also looked relieved, as if the weight of carrying her mistakes had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That depends on who you decide to become." Victoria left that afternoon with a cashier's check for $50,000 and a business card for a relocation specialist who would help her establish a new identity in whatever city she chose. I never saw her again, though I did receive a Christmas card from Phoenix the following year. No return address, just a generic holiday greeting, signed V with a short note, "Starting over. Thank you." I kept the card for a few days, then threw it away. Not out of cruelty, but out of recognition that some chapters of life are meant to be closed completely. Victoria was part of my past now, a person who had shaped me through pain but no longer had the power to touch the life I'd built. The Marcus Webb situation resolved itself exactly as I had expected. Within a week of Victoria's visit, federal agents raided his clubs and arrested him on charges ranging from drug trafficking to money laundering to conspiracy to commit terrorism. The local news covered it as a major law enforcement victory, but they had no idea that the operation had been triggered by a desperate woman begging her estranged sister for help. Webb cooperated with authorities, as men in his position always did when faced with life in federal prison. His cooperation led to arrests in Miami, Los Angeles, and Houston.
He was eventually relocated to a minimum security facility in Montana, where he would spend the next 15 years helping the government understand the organizational structures of the cartels he'd once served. I returned to my work at Meridian Defense Systems, to the quiet satisfaction of protecting systems that kept people safe, to the life I'd built through patience and competence, rather than charm or family connections. But something had shifted during those few hours with Victoria. Not regret exactly, but a kind of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. For 15 years, I'd carried the story of that night in Chicago like a weight in my chest. Not anger or hatred, but an unfinished narrative about power and justice, and the price of cruelty. Victoria's visit had allowed me to write the final chapter, to demonstrate not just to her, but to myself that the frightened girl who'd been thrown out with nothing had become someone who couldn't be thrown anywhere she didn't choose to go. The real revenge wasn't humiliating Victoria or making her suffer. It was becoming someone untouchable, someone whose help came with conditions, someone who had the power to solve problems that seemed impossible to ordinary people. The girl Victoria had discarded had become a woman who could make federal agents move with a few phone calls, who could make dangerous criminals disappear into the legal system, who could rewrite the rules of engagement between victim and predator. That was the story I'd been writing for 15 years, one line of code and one security protocol at a time. Victoria's visit had simply provided the opportunity to show her the final draft. But the story didn't end there. Because 3 months after Victoria left Chicago, I received a visit that would remind me just how completely my life had changed from the one she remembered. I was working late on a Friday evening, debugging a particularly stubborn vulnerability in a satellite communication system, when Jennifer knocked on my office door. It was almost 8 o'clock, well past normal business hours, but Meridian operated on military time. When national security was at stake, weekends and holidays were just words on a calendar. "Sarah?" Jennifer looked puzzled. "There are 3 men here to see you. They won't give me their names, but they have federal credentials. They said it's about your sister." My blood went cold. Victoria had been in Phoenix for 3 months, supposedly building a new life with the money I'd given her. If federal agents were here asking about her, it meant she'd gotten herself into trouble again. Serious trouble. The kind that could potentially affect my security clearance and career. "Show them to conference room A," I said, already thinking through damage control scenarios. And Jennifer, this conversation never happened. She nodded and disappeared down the hallway. I took a moment to compose myself, running through everything I knew about Victoria's situation and how it might have gone wrong. Had she violated some condition of Marcus Webb's cooperation agreement? Had she gotten involved with new criminals in Phoenix? Had she somehow compromised the federal investigation I'd helped trigger? Conference room A was smaller than the one where I'd met with Victoria, designed for sensitive conversations rather than formal presentations. When I opened the door, I found 3 men in dark suits waiting for me. They looked like federal agents, but something about their bearing suggested military backgrounds. Special operations, if I had to guess. The kind of men who were comfortable with violence and skilled at making problems disappear permanently. The oldest of the 3, a man in his 50s with graying hair and pale blue eyes, stood when I entered. "Miss Bennett, I'm Agent Thompson. These are my colleagues, Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen. We need to speak with you about your sister, Victoria. I closed the door and took a seat across from them, my hands folded calmly in my lap despite the anxiety churning in my stomach. What about her? Agent Thompson opened a file folder and placed several photographs on the table. They showed Victoria entering and leaving various buildings in Phoenix, meeting with people I didn't recognize, handling what appeared to be packages of money. The images were high-quality surveillance photos, the kind that required significant resources and legal authorization to obtain. Your sister has been under observation since she relocated to Phoenix 3 months ago, Thompson said. We've documented her involvement with several individuals connected to ongoing federal investigations. My heart sank. Victoria had lasted exactly 3 months before getting herself into trouble again. Whatever new scheme she'd gotten involved with was serious enough to warrant federal surveillance and bring agents to my office on a Friday night. What kind of involvement? I asked. Agent Rodriguez, a younger man with intense dark eyes, leaned forward. Money laundering. Courier services for a network that moves cash between cities. She's been transporting packages containing hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably without understanding the full scope of what she's involved in. Probably, Agent Chen added with a slight emphasis that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of Victoria's innocence. I studied the photographs, trying to understand how Victoria had managed to find trouble so quickly in a city where she knew no one. But even as I asked the question, I knew the answer. Victoria had always been attracted to easy money and dangerous men. Changing cities hadn't changed her fundamental nature. What does this have to do with me? I asked. Agent Thompson closed the file folder and looked at me directly. Miss Bennett, your security clearance gives you access to some of the most sensitive information in the federal government. Your sister's activities create a potential vulnerability that we can't ignore. There it was. The thing I'd been dreading since Victoria first walked into my office. Her problems had followed her to Phoenix and then followed me to my career. Everything I'd built, everything I had worked for, was now at risk because of choices she'd made that I couldn't control. Are you here to revoke my clearance? I asked. That's one option, but there's another possibility. We understand that you helped facilitate the investigation that led to Marcus Webb's arrest. Your cooperation was valuable, and your discretion was appreciated. We're prepared to offer you the same kind of arrangement regarding your sister's current situation.
I felt something cold settle in my chest. What kind of arrangement? Agent Rodriguez pushed another photograph across the table. This one showed Victoria meeting with a man in an expensive suit outside what appeared to be a private airport. The man she's meeting with is named Carlos Mendoza. He runs a money laundering operation that serves several drug cartels and at least 2 terrorist organizations. He's been on our watch list for 5 years, but he's careful, too careful for us to build a case against him through conventional means. You want Victoria to inform on him? I said. We want Victoria to continue doing exactly what she's been doing, Agent Chen said, with a few modifications. She'll carry recording devices, photograph documents, and report her activities to a handler. In exchange, she'll avoid prosecution for her current crimes and receive protection from any retaliation when the operation concludes. I stared at the photographs, trying to process what they were asking. They wanted to turn Victoria into an informant against people who killed informants as a matter of routine business practice. They were offering to protect her from prosecution in exchange for putting her life at risk. And if she refuses, I asked, then she'll be arrested on federal money laundering charges within 48 hours, Thompson said. The evidence is overwhelming. She's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. What does any of this have to do with me? Agent Rodriguez smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. Ms. Bennett, your sister doesn't know that we're aware of her activities. She thinks she's gotten away with starting over in Phoenix. But we've been watching her since the day she arrived, and we know about every crime she's committed. He paused, letting that sink in. We also know that she's been planning to contact you again. Phone records show that she's researched your current address and workplace. She's going to reach out to you soon, probably asking for more money or help with another crisis. Agent Chen leaned forward. When she does, we want you to convince her to cooperate with our investigation. She trusts you, or at least she trusts that you'll help family when they're in real trouble. She's more likely to agree to work with us if the suggestion comes from someone she believes has her best interests at heart. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This wasn't about my security clearance at all. They'd never intended to revoke it. They'd come here because they needed my help to flip Victoria into an informant, and they knew I was the only person who had any influence over her. "You want me to manipulate my sister into risking her life for your investigation?" I said. "We want you to help your sister make the smart choice when she's faced with limited options," Thompson corrected. "Cooperation keeps her out of prison and gives her a chance at a genuinely fresh start when this is over. Prison just makes her someone else's problem for the next 2 decades." They were right about the practical aspects. If Victorian was genuinely guilty of money laundering on the scale they were describing, cooperation with law enforcement was probably her best option. But they were asking me to be the one to convince her to take risks that could get her killed. "Why should I trust that you'll protect her?" I asked. Agent Rodriguez opened his suit jacket slightly, just enough for me to see the shoulder holster underneath. "Ms. Bennett, your sister is valuable to us now because of what she can provide, but you're valuable to us permanently because of what you already provide. Your work at Meridian Defense Systems helps protect American interests around the world. We have every incentive to make sure that work continues without disruption." The implicit threat was clear. My cooperation in this matter would be noted and appreciated. My refusal would also be noted, and the consequences might extend beyond just Victoria's situation. They weren't threatening my clearance directly, but they were making sure I understood that my professional future depended on my personal choices. Agent Thompson stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Think about it over the weekend, Ms. Bennett. We'll need an answer by Monday morning." They left their business cards on the table and walked out of the conference room without another word. I sat alone in the silence afterward, staring at the photographs of Victoria and trying to understand how my carefully controlled life had suddenly become so complicated. The irony was almost painful. For 15 years, I'd built walls between myself and the chaos that Victoria represented. I'd created a life where I was safe from her poor choices and destructive behavior. And now, because of my own success, because of the clearance and connections I'd worked so hard to earn, I was being dragged back into her problems whether I wanted to or not. But there was another layer to consider. The agents were right that Victoria was probably going to contact me again. She'd burned through the money I'd given her faster than I'd expected, which suggested she was making the same kinds of mistakes that had gotten her into trouble with Marcus Webb. If she was involved with people like Carlos Mendoza, she was already in mortal danger, whether she knew it or not. I could refuse to cooperate with the federal agents, but that wouldn't make Victoria safe. It would just mean she'd face whatever was coming without any protection or support. And while I'd made it clear that I was done with her problems, I wasn't sure I was prepared to let her die for them. The weekend passed slowly as I wrestled with the decision. I walked Murphy along the lakefront, tried to distract myself with work, called a few friends for advice without being able to explain what I was really asking about. But by Sunday night, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't about Victoria exactly. It was about understanding that some choices define who you are, regardless of their consequences. I could let my sister destroy herself through her own poor judgment, but I couldn't actively participate in putting her in danger, even if the alternative was worse. On Monday morning, I called Agent Thompson and told him I would help convince Victoria to cooperate. But I also told him that my cooperation came with conditions of my own.
I wanted regular updates on Victoria's safety. I wanted assurance that she would be extracted from the operation immediately if her cover was compromised. And I wanted a written guarantee that her cooperation would result in complete immunity from prosecution and genuine protection afterward. Agent Thompson agreed to my conditions without argument, which told me that they'd expected me to make exactly those demands. They knew me well enough to predict how I'd respond to the situation they'd created. That should have been concerning, but instead it felt like a kind of validation. I'd become someone predictable in the best possible way, someone whose principles were clear and whose word could be trusted. 3 days later, Victoria called me. The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night, jarring me from the light sleep I'd finally managed to find after hours of staring at the ceiling. I knew it was Victoria before I even looked at the caller ID. No one else in my life would call at that hour unless someone was dead or dying. And Victoria had never been particularly considerate about other people's schedules. "Hello, Victoria?" I said without preamble. "Sarah, Her voice was shaky, threaded with the kind of panic I remembered from our childhood when she'd gotten herself into trouble that was too big for lies to fix. "I need help, real help this time." I sat up in bed and turned on the lamp, checking the digital clock again. The federal agents had been right about the timing. They'd predicted she would contact me within the week, and here she was, 3 days later, calling with exactly the kind of crisis they'd described. "What kind of help?" I asked, though I already knew the general shape of what she was going to tell me. "I'm in Phoenix, and I've made a terrible mistake. There are people here who want to hurt me, and I can't go to the police because I might have done some things that weren't exactly legal." "What kind of things, Victoria?" The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then she took a shaky breath and began talking. The story she told was essentially the same one the federal agents had outlined for me, though Victoria's version was heavy on self-justification and light on personal responsibility. She'd met Carlos Mendoza at a bar 3 weeks after arriving in Phoenix. He was charming, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely interested in helping her start over in a new city. "He offered me a job," Victoria said. "Just simple courier work, driving packages from one place to another. The pay was incredible, Sarah. More money than I'd ever made at any legitimate job." "Did you ask what was in the packages?" "He said it was business documents, contracts and financial papers for his import company. I didn't ask too many questions because the money was so good, and I really needed it after what happened in Chicago." Another lie. Victoria had always been curious to a fault, always poking into other people's business whether they wanted her to or not. She'd known exactly what kind of packages she was transporting, but she'd convinced herself that ignorance provided some kind of legal protection. "How much trouble are you in?" I asked. "Carlos wants me to do something that feels really dangerous. He's asked me to carry a package to Los Angeles, but this one is different, heavier. And he keeps emphasizing how important it is that I don't let it out of my sight, that I don't let anyone else handle it or look inside." I closed my eyes. Victoria was describing exactly the kind of high-value transport that would interest federal law enforcement. If Carlos Mendoza was asking her to carry something that valuable across state lines, it meant he trusted her enough to handle the most sensitive parts of his operation. It also meant that if she was caught, she'd be facing federal charges that would put her away for decades. "What kind of help do you want me to do about it?" I asked. "I need somewhere to run to. Somewhere safe where I can figure out my next move. I know you said I couldn't contact you unless it was a genuine emergency, but Sarah, I think this qualifies." It did qualify, but probably not in the way Victoria imagined. She was in genuine danger, but not just from Carlos Mendoza. She was also in danger from the federal agents who were watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to flip her into an informant. And she was in danger from me because I was about to manipulate her into making a choice that could save her life or end it. "Where are you calling from?" I asked. "A payphone outside a gas station. I left my cell phone at home because I was worried they might be tracking it." Smart thinking, but probably too late. If the federal agents had been watching her for 3 months, they'd already compromised her phone, her apartment, probably her car. Victoria's attempt at operational security was like closing the barn door after the horses had not only escaped, but started their own ranch in the next county. "Listen to me carefully," I said. "You're in more trouble than you realize, but there's a way out. You need to come to Chicago immediately. Tonight." "But Carlos is the least of your problems right now, Victoria," I interrupted. "Pack one bag with essential items only. Leave everything else behind. Drive to the airport and take the first flight to Chicago that has available seats. Pay cash if you have it, credit card if you don't." "But what about—" "Victoria." I put steel in my voice, the tone I used when dealing with contractors who thought they could cut corners on national security projects. "This is not a negotiation. If you want my help, you'll do exactly what I'm telling you to do."
If you want to handle this on your own, that's your choice, but don't call me again. The silence on the other end told me that Victoria was finally beginning to understand how serious the situation had become. When she spoke again, her voice was small and frightened in a way that took me back to our childhood. Okay, she said. I'll come to Chicago. But Sarah, what if they try to stop me? They won't, I said with more confidence than I felt. They want you to run. It's part of their plan. That last part was speculation on my behalf, but it felt right. The federal agents had been watching Victoria for 3 months without arresting her, which meant they wanted her to remain operational until she could provide them with something more valuable than just another money laundering prosecution. Her running to me would give them exactly the leverage they needed to flip her. Text me your flight information when you have it, I continued. I'll pick you up at the airport. Thank you, Victoria said, and for the first time since our conversation in the conference room 3 months earlier, she sounded genuinely grateful rather than manipulative. I know I don't deserve this, but thank you. After she hung up, I sat in my dark bedroom and tried to reconcile what I was about to do with the person I thought I'd become. For 15 years, I'd built my identity around being someone who couldn't be manipulated, who made decisions based on logic rather than emotion, who protected herself through competence and careful planning. And now I was about to manipulate my own sister into cooperating with a federal investigation that could get her killed. But the alternative was letting her stumble blindly into a situation where she'd either end up in prison for the next 20 years or dead in a ditch outside Phoenix. At least this way, she'd have some protection and some chance of survival. It wasn't a good choice, but it was the best choice available, given the circumstances she'd created. I called Agent Thompson and left a voicemail letting him know that Victoria would be arriving in Chicago within the next 12 hours. Then I got dressed and began preparing for a conversation that would determine whether my sister lived or died. Victoria's flight landed at O'Hare at 6:30 a.m. on Thursday morning. I found her at the baggage claim, looking exhausted and paranoid, constantly checking over her shoulder as if she expected Carlos Mendoza's people to materialize out of the crowd of business travelers and tourists. She'd aged visibly in the 3 months since I'd last seen her, the stress of living a double life etched in the lines around her eyes and the way she held her shoulders. "Sarah," she said when she saw me, relief flooding her voice. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." I said I would. I took her single small suitcase. "My car's in short-term parking." We didn't talk during the drive to my house. Victoria stared out the window at the Chicago skyline, probably remembering the last time she'd lived in this city and how it had ended. I focused on driving and mentally rehearsing the conversation we were about to have. My house in Lincoln Park was nothing like the apartment we'd shared 15 years earlier. It was a 3-bedroom Victorian that I'd bought and renovated myself, with hardwood floors, exposed brick walls, and enough security features to make a Secret Service agent proud. Victoria looked around with undisguised amazement when we walked inside. "This place is incredible," she said. "You did all this yourself?" "Most of it," I said, leading her to the kitchen. "Coffee?" "Please." I made coffee while Victoria explored the main floor, taking in the built-in bookshelves, the original artwork, the comfortable furniture that spoke of success without ostentation. When I handed her a mug, she was standing in front of a framed photograph on the mantel that showed me receiving a commendation from the Secretary of Defense. "I had no idea," she said softly. "I mean, I knew you were doing well, but I didn't realize you were doing this well. Success tends to compound over time when you make good choices," I said, settling into the armchair across from where she stood. Victoria flinched slightly at the implication, but didn't argue. She sat down on the couch and wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if trying to absorb its warmth. "So," she said, "what do I do now?" This was the moment I'd been preparing for since Agent Thompson's visit. Everything depended on how I handled the next few minutes. I needed to convince Victoria to cooperate with the federal investigation without revealing that I already knew about it. I needed to make her believe that the suggestion was coming from my concern for her welfare rather than external pressure. "Tell me exactly what you've gotten yourself into in Phoenix. Everything. Don't leave out details because you think you're protecting me." Victoria spent the next 20 minutes laying out the full scope of her involvement with Carlos Mendoza's operation. As she talked, I realized the federal agents had only given me part of the picture. Victoria wasn't just transporting money between cities, she was also handling communications between different cells of the organization, carrying encrypted phones and memory cards, and serving as a liaison between Mendoza and clients who preferred to work through intermediaries. In other words, she wasn't just a courier. She was a trusted member of a criminal enterprise that spanned multiple states and involved connections to international drug cartels. The federal charges she was facing would be far more serious than simple money laundering. "Victoria," I said when she finished, "you're not just in trouble. You're in the kind of trouble that ends you spending the rest of your life in federal prison." Her face went pale. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what you've described isn't small-time criminal activity. It's organized crime with national security implications. The people you've been working for don't just sell drugs. They launder money for terrorist organizations and foreign intelligence services." Victoria stared at me with growing horror. "How do you know all this?" "Because it's my job to know about threats to national security. The question is what you're going to do about it." Before she could answer, my doorbell rang. Victoria jumped like she'd been shot, spilling coffee across her lap. "It's all right," I said, standing up. "I know who it is." I opened the door to find Agent Thompson standing on my porch, looking exactly as professional and implacable as he had in my conference room. Behind him were Agent Rodriguez and Agent Chen, both wearing expressions that suggested this conversation was going to be serious.
"Miss Bennett," Thompson said, "thank you for calling us. Is your sister ready to hear what we have to offer?" Victoria appeared in the hallway behind me, her eyes wide with panic. "Sarah, what's going on? Who are these men?" "They're federal agents," I said calmly, "and they're here to save your life." The next hour unfolded exactly as I'd expected. The agents laid out their evidence against Victoria, showed her photographs of her activities in Phoenix, and explained the charges she was facing. Victoria went through all the stages of denial, anger, bargaining, and fear before finally accepting that cooperation was her only viable option. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she asked finally. Agent Rodriguez opened a briefcase and removed a collection of small electronic devices. "You're going to continue working for Carlos Mendoza, but now you'll be working for us too. These are recording devices, cameras, and tracking equipment. You'll document everything he asks you to do, everyone he asks you to meet with, and every location you visit." "For how long?" "Until we have enough evidence to dismantle his entire organization," Agent Chen said. "Probably 6 to 8 months. Victoria looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I can't do this. If they find out I'm working with the FBI, they'll kill me." "They'll kill you anyway if you get arrested and they think you might talk," I said. "This way, you'll have protection." Agent Thompson nodded. "We'll have surveillance teams watching you at all times. If your cover is compromised, we'll extract you immediately. And when the operation is complete, you'll enter the witness protection program with a new identity and a clean slate." "What if I refuse?" "Then you'll be arrested as soon as you step outside this house," Thompson said matter-of-factly. "The evidence we've gathered is sufficient for conviction on multiple federal charges. You're looking at a minimum of 25 years in prison." Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, staring at the recording devices spread across my coffee table. Finally, she looked up at me. "What do you think I should do?" This was the moment everything had been building toward, the moment where I would either help my sister make the choice that might save her life, or watch her choose the path that would almost certainly destroy it. "I think you should cooperate," I said. "But not because I care about what happens to Carlos Mendoza or his organization. I think you should cooperate because it's your only chance to survive the mess you've created." Victoria nodded slowly. "All right, I'll do it." The agent spent another hour training Victoria on how to use the surveillance equipment, giving her emergency contact numbers, and establishing protocols for regular check-ins. When they finally left, Victoria and I sat alone in my living room, both understanding that our relationship had fundamentally changed once again. "I know you didn't have to do this," Victoria said quietly. "You could have let them arrest me and gone back to your life. Why didn't you?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because 15 years ago,
You taught me that family doesn't mean anything when it's convenient to throw it away. But I'm not you, Victoria. I don't abandon people when they need help, even when they don't deserve it. Victoria flew back to Phoenix the next morning with a new identity, new equipment, and new purpose. Over the following 8 months, she fed information to the FBI that led to the arrest of over 40 people connected to Carlos Mendoza's organization. She testified in federal court, helped prosecutors understand the structure of international money laundering operations, and provided intelligence that prevented at least 3 terrorist attacks on American soil. When it was over, she disappeared into the Witness Protection Program with a new name, a new face, and a new chance at life. I never saw her again after that morning at O'Hare Airport, but I received updates from Agent Thompson for several years afterward. Victoria was doing well. She'd found legitimate work, started a family, and was living the kind of quiet, law-abiding life that our parents had always hoped she'd choose. The real victory wasn't that Victoria had finally learned to make better choices. It was that I'd learned to make choices based on who I wanted to be, rather than who I'd been hurt by. The frightened girl who'd been thrown out of her apartment 15 years earlier had become a woman who could mobilize federal law enforcement resources to protect the sister who'd betrayed her. That transformation wasn't about revenge or forgiveness. It was about understanding that real power comes from being able to choose kindness, even when it's difficult, and strength, even when it would be easier to be cruel. Victoria never apologized for that night in Chicago, and I never asked her to. Some wounds are meant to heal into scars that remind us of who we've become. Years later, I still think about that conversation in my living room when Victoria asked why I'd helped her, despite everything she'd done to me. The answer was simpler than either of us realized at the time. I helped her because I could, and because helping her was the right thing to do, not for her sake, but for mine. The girl who'd been discarded had become a woman who would never discard anyone, no matter how much they might deserve it. And that, more than any career success or government recognition, was the real measure of who I'd chosen to become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.